Distinguished panelists, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our side event, Mitigating Disaster Risks in a COVID Era, Faith-Based Perspectives. My name is Steve Chu, and I serve as a representative of Buddhist Tzu Foundation to the United Nations. I'm super grateful to be with you all today in this virtual space as we come together in the spirit of mutual learning and sharing of best practices to unpack how can we, in this strange moment we find ourselves in, better mitigate disaster risks, build resilience, particularly within the most vulnerable communities, and ensure that no one is left behind. Over the past 2 days at the high-level political forum, we've been hearing a lot of conversation around how COVID-19 has transformed the landscape of sustainable development. There's been a lot of concerns among member states, UN agencies, and civil society that we're not on track to be where we need to be to ensure that all of our benchmarks of Agenda 2030 are met. There's also been a lot of talk about how COVID-19 has created a moment for us to reflect of how we can better work together, this need for a whole of society approach. And it's with this spirit of whole of society that we'd like to convene our side event today. We recognize that in engaging stakeholders, there's various ways and practices that are present in how we engage stakeholders that can lead to greater success or challenges in implementation. So for our contribution at the high-level political forum, we'd like to bring together this group of faith leaders and interfaith leaders to examine what faith-based groups have been doing since the onset of COVID-19, and how have we not only been responding to the impacts of COVID-19, but also building on that opportunity and that moment to ensure that we build resilience and we build mitigative efforts into these communities that we're addressing. As we begin to move from response to recovery and preparedness, we really want to highlight the transformative actions that have been taken by faith-based organizations that can be applied by any respective civil society organization, UN agency, or member state as they begin to envision a better way towards recovery, a greener, cleaner recovery. The various pathways that we'll be exploring today include, but are not limited to, food security, climate action, community-led development, and disaster risk reduction. So it's with this that I'm very grateful to be able to introduce our illustrious panelists. We have Hugh Bainan, who serves as the liaison officer for the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction in New York. We have Deborah Boudreau, who's the executive vice president of Buddhist Tzu Foundation USA. Audrey Kitagawa, who's the chair of the board of trustees of the Parliament of the World's Religions. Reverend Fletcher Harper, who serves as our executive director of Green Faith, and Father Eris Miranda, who is the director of Chameleon Disaster Service International. Together in this space of virtual Zoom, we hope that we can come together and learn and really share how we can move forward as an international community. So first, I'd like to ask our panel, how has the global pandemic impacted our ability to work on Agenda 2030 and ensure the resilience of the most vulnerable? What challenges have we seen emerge? We know COVID is happening at a moment where we also see the climate crisis make disasters worse, and we're seeing rising levels of inequity. And there's a lot of compounding factors that we as faith-based organizations have been trying to address. But in this moment of COVID, we've seen a lot of our traditional ways of being become disrupted. So I'd like to spend this first segment exploring with you all how we have been challenged as faith-based orgs and organizations working with faith-based institutions. That being said, for all of us who are joining online, we welcome your engagement in the chat box. If you have additional reactions or questions, feel free to type them in and they'll be relayed to our speakers as they come through this moment. So with that, I'd now like to pass the floor over to Hugh for some reflections from UNDRR's perspective.
Hi, yes, thank you so much, Steve, for that introduction. I hope you can all hear me well. Great. Yes, as Steve said, my name is Hugh Bain. I'm with the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction based in New York. And UNDRR is the focal point entity for the implementation of the Sendai framework in the UN system, working with across the UN system and also with partners beyond the UN system, academia and NGOs and science and technology actors, trying to galvanize a real global response to implement the Sendai framework. And our role here in New York is very much focused on this policy coherence around disaster risk reduction, climate action, and sustainable development, so that everything that we do, all the policies and investments that we make, are risk informed. So I'd like to really thank Tzu Chi Foundation for inviting us back for a second year. It's really been a wonderful partnership with Tzu Chi, and the more I learn about the work you do, the more amazed I am. But I'll go into the first question of how the pandemic has really impacted work on the 2030 agenda and resilience of the most vulnerable. I think, as Steve mentioned, and it's already been said, I think many times during the first 2 days of the HLPF, is that it's really set back progress towards the SDGs, but also towards climate action and disaster risk reduction as well. It's, you know, the impact, well, it's first and foremost, it's a health issue, it's a pandemic, but it's obviously become a social and economic disaster. And we really must think about it in those terms. It's increased the vulnerability, exposure of some of the, the poorest and most vulnerable people. It's increased their vulnerability to climate change and other disasters. Already seeing people, as happens often in all disasters, adapting negative coping strategies when it comes to issues around food security. In many disasters, people do adapt coping strategies that have a further negative impact on the environment and on the ecosystem in which they live. And I think we're going to see that happening more and more as this crisis unfortunately deepens. So it's really progress that has been made on reducing vulnerability, on reducing exposure. I think in some of the poorest countries, unfortunately, will be severely impacted by this. So it's also shown the difficulties in disaster preparedness and response for climate-related disasters. Some countries have done a very good job. I think listened to a panel this morning on Bangladesh and the recent cyclone they had, how they managed to still evacuate many people and keep a degree of social distancing, although it's not easy during such events. But I think many countries are struggling with that. But it's diverting attention away, I think, from risk reduction efforts, which is completely natural and understandable with a disaster, with a pandemic of this magnitude. But it's diverting attention and funding to focus on a single issue, on one disaster. So we really need to use this opportunity, for want of a better word, and the momentum to really see disaster in a much more holistic and multi-hazard approach. So we can't just turn our attention to one disaster to the next disaster. We need to have this multi-hazard approach to risk reduction. And as far as difficulties, I think from a DRR perspective, is we have the first target of the Sendai framework, target E, is to be achieved by the end of this year. It's for countries to have national and local disaster risk reduction strategies in place. There are, I think, almost 90 countries that have reported that they have these strategies in place, which is good, but certainly not good enough. So at a time when we need a really concerted effort, political commitment and a push to have these strategies in place, is a time when our attention is being diverted by this huge crisis. So that's going to be a difficulty, and unfortunately quite ironic. And these strategies, really the core of the Sendai framework is this participatory approach. So the idea of having forums where people can come together at local and national level to really have this participatory and inclusive approach to risk reduction is, of course, compromised during this pandemic. And maybe one last point I'll make is that, actually 2 points, if I may, is that it's really exposed well-known deficiencies, I think, in our current economic and development models. When we look at the way that economies have created more and more vulnerability over the years, and it hasn't been equal distribution of wealth within and across countries. I think that is well known, and that's being exacerbated by this pandemic. But I think it's also highlighting that risk is really embedded in our development model, unfortunately. Economic development, economic growth, and even many investments and policies that are termed sustainable development are actually creating risk, often unintentionally, very much unintended consequences of these policies, of these investments. I think it's really brought to the fore that the current system that we have is creating this risk, and it's systemic. It's across all systems. We're seeing that what was a health issue is having social, economic, and probably impacts across more sectors, and that disasters are cascading. They're interlinkages between the impacts they've had that's all across sectors, and we really have to get a grip on that. And I think it's really exposed globally a deficiency in understanding the systemic nature of risk and how our policies create risk, but how conversely we need policies and investments that reduce risk. So managing those trade-offs. And the final point I'll talk about is building back better. It's become a buzzword. It's really a core of the Sendai framework. It's been there for 5 years in priority 4, but now it's got a lot of traction. But we're seeing that it's very difficult to build back better in the middle of a pandemic or in the middle of a climate event. And the Sendai framework actually is one word that goes before build back better, is prepare to build back better. I think that's something that's been overlooked and it's become a challenge, and hopefully we can raise awareness on the need for that. Is before a disaster like this, you need to have legislation in place, finance in place, you need to have understanding of community needs when it comes to building back better. It's very difficult to do so after the event. So really the focus on preparing to build back better and not waiting. And I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks, Hugh. Really loving the remarks around preparedness and this need to reconceptualize how we see disasters. Earlier in our questions asked to attendees, there was an individual that asked if we can define COVID-19 as a disaster. And I think as a systemic disruptor of all things that we have in place, we can definitely perceive it as a disaster. I'll now pass it over to Deborah to share reflections from Tzu Chi's perspective on the challenges that have been faced with this pandemic.
Yes, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, good night. I think all the panelists, this time we're coming from all over the world. It's very nice for Hugh to set up a UN perspective. And Buddhist Tzu Chi Foundation is a INGO NGO. So I'm going to share with you from the global perspective down to the regional perspective about community program. When this year, next slide please. When this year started the COVID-19, Buddhist Tzu Chi Foundation has been approached by various interfaith religious representative, also the most important, the first responder, and the hospital providers. There's a lot of huge needs. And then because of the situation coming so suddenly, so we talk about preparation from SARS, H1N1, Ebola, now COVID. The pandemic learning curve never stopped. So from February until today, you're going to see the number, the diagram you're going to see. Tzu Chi has been able to provide it 74 countries as an NGO, INGO, 74 countries to provide PPE, close to 21 million PPE items. And we still have 12 countries under the processing for delivery because the infrastructure, transportation, country lockdown, so many challenges. We still have 12 countries rely on our PPE, close to 2 million PPE can be delivered. Then from the first responder, and then slowly we identify the socioeconomic impact for the community is huge. It's not just the hospital staff, it's not the nursing home. How about the general public? Under such a huge demanding about PPE shortage. So there's a situation comes up how to do the cloth mask. So we have been able to work with various countries, empower the local community, especially women and vulnerable, to prepare 271,000 cloth masks. Then from cloth mask, we do protective suits. At the early beginning, you can see in some countries, I don't want to name the countries, but we can see through the Facebook, social media, Some of them use the shower curtain. Some of them use the raincoat to do the PPE to protect themselves. Some of them even use trash bag to become a protect gun to protect their patient treatment situation. So there's so many creativity way, but also sharing the situation, what's the community in need. So we have from PPE, you have professional, identified, certified, good quality, and to the homemade PPE. The face shields is always the most important ones. Now we see more than 10 different style of the face shields and the gloves. So from this, what I really want to share is the whole process. When we talk about SDG 17, next slide, please. The 2030, it's a direction. Next slide, yes. The 2030 is a directions. And recently we have a chance to talk to the World Wildlife. They have a natural positive by 2030, this topic. And based on the topic, they mentioned about the future 4 different directions to prepare our Mother Earth. This is very good, but the whole conversation really coming to during the pandemic, this time COVID-19 will not walk away, okay? 2030 for SDG, for climate change, we are going to face it. But as a faith-based leaders, what can we empower our community? So the compassion in action and sequence of delivery also empower local ownership, the community lead program. So based on this time of the COVID-19, recently, in order for us to continue to remind the community, the foundation has come out a very unique approach using the cartoon every day, bring one wisdom to the family members. For example, on the June 29, working together to mitigate disasters, the message indicate in times of safety and stability, we should be vigilant of future crisis. If we use our water resources with restraint, we will likely experience the suffering of drought in the future. So from COVID, it's not only the pandemic. We teach people wash the hand. So wash the hand triggered to using the water. So how to remind people use the water wisely. Okay, so this is one wisdom of the day to bring community, bring the home in order to achieve 2030 SDG 17, every single stage related to water. And then try to look into June 27. Many drops of water make a river and many grains of rice make a bushel. The collective karma that sentient beings have created over a long period of time causes disaster which are increasingly frequent and severe. So this message to tell everybody, it's going to be getting more and more challenged. Yes, we're going to have a positive, bright future, but how can we be aware this kind of climate change, climate justice, and social economic impact is going to happen, it's going to be with us. So what kind of attitude we need to be? So based on the June 12th, the message will be an astute mindset comes from the gratitude in our hearts, the cause and the condition which have enabled Tzu Chi missions to develop arise from the mindset. So we have to be gratitude. When we see the challenge now, COVID-19 is a crisis, but it's also an opportunity. How can we grab this opportunity to learn from the experience? We need to be grateful, we need to be gratitude. So when we do the mitigation preparation, we need to be position ourselves as a positive attitude rather than negative. Whenever we wear the PPE, we prepare the PPE, we need to be more cautious. We need to identify the user. So this kind of message for us to go into 2030 to reach the SDG, integrate with the pandemic challenge, every one of us be mindful. We need to empower ourselves, and the sequence of delivery will be updated. The most important, be compassionate to our Mother Earth. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah, for really building on Hugh's comments about this multiplicity of hazards that we're seeing come forth, and this perpetual escalation, whether that's of resource depletion and the rising of climate risks that we're facing, and then looking at some of the various ways that we've been trying to overcome these, particularly thinking back to this notion of how it's hard to get into communities when we don't have the logistical means. Right. And so we're grateful for partners like Caddis International who have been able to work hand in hand with us in moments like this to really build out the capacity to help those in need. So I'll now turn it over to Father Aris to share with us from Caddis International's perspective, what are some of the challenges that COVID-19 has really brought in your org's work to really address not only the resilience of all, but this growing global health pandemic that we see.
Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to everybody here. So thank you very much for that kind introduction, Steve, and thank you for having me here in this very important discussion. So, well, obviously, COVID-19 pandemic has affected Caddis internationally, or negatively and positively. So negatively, we're affected in the following manner. First, it has prevented us from carrying out our projects as scheduled, particularly in Asia, Caribbean, and Africa. All our staff and local partners were grounded or shifted to the most urgent concern, which is the COVID-19 pandemic. It has affected us psychologically and spiritually as individuals and as an organization, injecting fear and hesitation to serve in creative and better ways. It has paralyzed us into inaction for a few weeks, feeling helpless and vulnerable too, along with the rest. Personally, it has shaken the foundation of my values and commitment for not being able to mobilize and respond immediately to the pandemic, as well as to our ongoing projects of building resilience in most vulnerable communities. You know, I'm a member of a religious Catholic congregation known as the Chameleons, whose main ministry is to care for the sick. And we have that fourth vow of service to the sick, even in danger to our own life. So somehow this commitment is put into question. However, these situations also had a positive impact on us. First, that it has galvanized us into action after some weeks of helplessness and paralysis. So we're able, after a few weeks of reflection, we're able to mobilize certain help responding to this COVID pandemic, like distribution of PPEs and so on and so forth, and online counseling that we offered to those who are in need. Secondly, it has injected a sense of urgency and made us reach out to our leaders in the field collaboratively via digital communication, social media, and email. Our organization were not really used to do these things, but right now we have no other way to reach out. However, we gathered often, and this is quite good because we're able to listen to one another. We got more funding and resources for COVID emergency response, and with some more funding, we are moving into discovering ideas with local partners and building local capacities and post-COVID resilience, focus on strengthening the local community, institutions, and systems to mitigate the severe impact of the pandemic, and integrating climate action and engaging the youth in building up constituency for youth-led action. And lastly, it has forced us to rethink our traditional or conventional ways of carrying our programs and services. I think, Steve, you have mentioned that COVID period is, give us a moment to reflect. Okay? So we are deeply thinking of creative and innovative ways to address the vulnerability in a manner that provides space for our partner marginalized communities to participate in taking action. In fact, our responses, like the emergency response that we did, it was a way for us to reach out to communities and really to be with them, of course, maintaining, of course, the social distance, in order to get to know really what they need and what resources do they have. And I think it helped us a lot to plan for the post-COVID resilience program. So, well, that's how we experience the organization as far as COVID is concerned.
Thank you, Father Aris. And thank you for once again reiterating how COVID-19 has really brought disruptions on these key services that faith-based orgs have been providing. Often we're at the front lines providing critical services that no one else is giving to these communities. And for that to be shaken and disrupted is deeply disheartening to hear. But I'm grateful that you also paired that with the reflection that we're finding new and creative ways to still address and help these communities through participatory practices. One thing that we've been learning very much through this COVID response has been how key partnerships are to really ensure sustainability and deepening of impact. So I'm grateful that Audrey from the Parliament of the World's Religions is here with us as one of the largest collective of religious organizations to be able to be in network with each other and to learn from each other. I'd love, Audrey, for you to share some thoughts and reflections on how COVID has impacted PWR's community and also what those challenges look like in this moment.
Thank you very much, and my deepest appreciation to the Tzu Chi Foundation for this invitation to share on this panel. And it is within the context of the high-level political forum on sustainable development. And this global pandemic has certainly impacted everyone. It has impacted our global international platform because the Parliament is a huge platform for communities of faith, people of faith and non-faith. And so we are an open house to be able to have dialogue and ongoing conversations with constituents all over the world. And the Parliament of the World's Religions, like Tzu Chi Foundation, is a member of the UN Interfaith, a Multi-Faith Advisory Council, which is comprised of approximately 45 faith-based organizations that have international outreach and is represented at this UN Multi-Faith Advisory Council by the 45 CEOs of these organizations. So I would like to put that in the context of whether this pandemic has impacted the work of the UN 2030 agenda, because I'm also chair of the Parliament of the World's Religions United Nations Task Force. So I'd like to relate it to the UN 2030 agenda within the context of this high-level political forum that this event is scheduled in. And I first would like to take this opportunity to explain to our listening audience a little bit about the UN 2030 agenda, because these are terms that we may be familiar with, but I think it is fair for our audience who may not be familiar with UN lingo to have some information about it. So basically, the agenda is a commitment to the eradication of poverty and to achieve sustainable development by 2030 worldwide. And so ensuring that no one is left behind. The adoption of the 2030 agenda was a landmark achievement because it provided for a shared global vision towards sustainable development for all. It is based upon the foundational vision of a world of universal respect for human rights and human dignity, the rule of law, justice, equality, and non-discrimination. It therefore builds upon other important UN documents and instruments and goals, including the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So due to the high unemployment rates, health issues that have taxed the healthcare system and healthcare providers, the shutdown of businesses and their attempts to restart their businesses, with this pandemic not only ongoing but rising, especially in certain states in the United States, the ability to achieve the 2030 agenda, which is only 10 years away, has of course been delayed. And we are basically faced with unprecedented facts that we have been dealing with since the onset of this pandemic. But it also addresses, raised by the other panelists, about the environment. And of course, the UN, through United Nations Environment Program, has really been seeking to address this with faith-based communities. So UNEP has a Faith for Earth initiative as well as the Interfaith Rainforest initiative. And basically the toolkits that have been provided to communities of faith through the Interfaith Rainforest initiative specifically addresses this pandemic as having an animal to human pathogenic transfer and zoonotic diseases. And I wanted to share with our audience that this very important primer will be made available publicly on July 14th by the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative. And it is Forests and Pandemics, How Protecting Tropical Forests Can Prevent Coronaviruses and Other Emerging Diseases. And it shows that our incursions into the rainforest and the destruction of the rainforests have certainly had this incursion by humans into animal territories, increasing this animal to human pathogenic transfers, making it more prominent. But this also, these transfers are actually the causative of these pandemics. So that's very important for us to learn about. But we need not get depressed because the United Nations Environment Interfaith Rainforest Initiative has created very important toolkits specifically for faith communities, but it is applicable to faith-based as well as non-faith-based communities all around the world to learn about this important causative connection between animal to human pathogenic transfers. So I'd like to have the audience know that this important issue primer will be made available to all around the world, and especially to faith communities. So stay tuned to our respective websites, including the Parliament of the World's Religions websites, which has published already a resource guide and toolkits for faith communities to understand better the issue. So the work of communities of faith has definitely increased, because communities of faith have historically been the ones to rise to the forefront of help whenever disasters, natural or otherwise, occur. And wherever people in need exist, faith communities are there to help them, because that is what religious and faith communities do. Implement the practices and teachings of their traditions to love one another, serve one another, and to express kindness in action. So we have seen in this country in particular, because I'm sitting here in New York City, which was at one time the epicenter of the pandemic, we've seen more people going to food banks and seeking help just to get their families fed, as unemployment rates skyrocketed, and those living from paycheck to paycheck having to make hard choices as to whether they buy food, which is necessary, or necessary medication, or pay their rent. So these are actual hard choices that people have to make. And a lot of faith communities have ramped up their soup kitchens and stepped up to provide masks, as Deborah shared. The Tzu Chi Foundation has well done, including personal protection equipment, hand sanitizers, not only for first responders, but for communities in need. And as churches, temples, and mosques all around the world close down, Many people in different parts of the world who counted on these religious communities to provide food for them no longer had access to this important lifeline. So I'd like to share one of many examples of how religious communities coming together have achieved shared goals. So just one example here in New York City, an important example. In New York City, Samaritan's Purse, which is one of the largest evangelical institutions in the country, was asked by the Federal Emergency Management Agency, the Department of Homeland Security, and the White House to take a team to New York to build a 14-tent, 68-bed respiratory care hospital in Central Park in late March. Then Mount Sinai Hospital asked if the ministry could also help put beds in the church, St. John the Divine, which is an iconic building in New York City. And because St. John the Divine had the building and Samaritan's Purse had the volunteers. So the partnership between Samaritan's Purse and a legacy institution such as St. John the Divine, which has a reputation as being the center for liberal causes, that connection was highly unusual. But the Episcopal Church's presiding Bishop Michael Curry said, "We have to join hands together, transcending our differences." He said this terrible pandemic is forcing or compelling us to find a way to love each other and to care for each other. So Good Samaritan's Purse, Mr. Graham said, "We all need to be working together and put our differences aside. We're not there to talk about politics, we're here to save lives." Here we have an example of religious communities working together to put aside any possible theological or ideological differences to do what was needful to save lives. Ultimately, that is the goal of religions, to work towards harmony and to achieve transcendence of all differences, to come together in our common morality and humanity to meet shared goals. So thank you.
Thank you, Audrey, for building on Father Aris's points about how through this pandemic, we've really seen a rise in need from these vulnerable communities that we're serving, and how we've been called to a higher purpose and higher action through this collaborative effort of sharing of resources that aren't traditionally necessarily given, right? We're finding these moments to transcend our differences and to implement kindness in action. So I'll now pass it over to Reverend Fletcher Harper to share from Green Faith's perspectives, what are some of the challenges that Green Faith has really faced in its work in forwarding Agenda 2030, particularly looking at the faith and climate movement and how we've been challenged in this moment to come together.
Thanks, Steve. And what I say is going to reflect and draw on things that my spiritual and religious colleagues have already said, and what Deborah said and what Father Aris said and what Audrey said. So I'll be reprising in a different kind of tone, working around the theme of disruption. We're an interfaith environmental, climate and environmental network, and we've known for many years that one of the things that climate change inflicts on the world is disruption at a very painful and devastating level. And there are a lot of communities that have already been experiencing that disruption for a number of years. And so I think one of the things that we need to recognize is in this moment when there is a large-scale global disruption because of the pandemic, we shouldn't forget that many, many communities have been experiencing disruptions already related to climate change and will continue to do so in the future. So what does disruption do? What does it mean? What we see in the work that we do, in the conversations that we have with people around the world, it disrupts and upsets people's sense of normalcy. It disrupts their attention and their ability to pay attention because of the numerous preoccupations that they have that are pressing and that are very real. It disrupts their financial well-being, particularly those who are most vulnerable. and it disrupts the lives of those who are seeking to provide valuable services in communities of greatest need. We work through a campaign that we're part of called the Shine campaign, which is designed to accelerate investment and grant making in decentralized renewable energy projects in regions of the world that lack access to electricity. We find that the local energy champions, the social entrepreneurs who are doing the hard work of developing innovative business models to bring access to electricity to communities that need it, that in this moment, their supply chains, everything that enables them to do business is disrupted. I think also there is a disruption of an ability to think longer term, which is fully understandable because when any individual or community is under stress, the order of the day is immediate survival and not longer term thinking. In this moment when disruption is so prevalent, I think that it's vitally important to draw a lesson from the recent movement and calls for racial justice that have played out so visibly in the United States. And while this may sound slightly discordant, what I would like to suggest is that it is very important in this moment of the pandemic not to forget and not to lose track of major economic and political forces that cause the kinds of preventable disruptions and preventable disasters that Deborah spoke so clearly about avoiding earlier on. And to find ways to channel the discomfort with that reality, the sadness, and the anger about it into productive action. For example, we know beyond any reasonable doubt that the continued growth of the fossil fuel sector is a guarantee of massive, painful future disruptions. We know that the continuation of deforestation, as Audrey talked about, and the large-scale animal agriculture sector is a guarantee of massive, painful future disruptions. And in this moment of pandemic, I think this is part of what the Build Back Better movement is and theme is all about. We cannot lose sight of those forces presently whose day-to-day activities are responsible for major future disruptions. We can't lose sight of that. It's extraordinarily hard to reckon with that because at a moment when so many people are in desperate need, it's very understandable that their attention is focused on survival. But I think we have to look to the Black Lives Matter movement as a movement that had laid the groundwork so that even in the midst of a pandemic, when there was an unspeakable act committed, there was a mobilization that was able to happen. And I think part of what the religious sector needs to be doing is laying the groundwork so that more and more as society experiences these kinds of painful disruptions, there is also the ability to rise up at scale and to press for change that really does set the world on a better course. I think one of the things that all of us share as people of faith is a conviction that a better world is possible. And these disruptions, whether it be the pandemic or climate disruptions that we're certainly going to see, need to become the occasions for large-scale moral uprisings so that we can change the course that we're currently on, not just reinforce the status quo, but really take this opportunity as a crisis that can lead to a better future. So I think my sort of theme is really leaning into the disruption and leaning into the reality that we must make both long-term and short-term change in these moments of crisis.
Thank you, Fletcher, for those reflections, really building on everyone's thoughts around how challenging this moment is for us to continue the critical work we need to do to ensure that a better future is present. I think you're right in that there's a lot of short-termness in how we as an international community can see the challenges that we face, but we need to rise above that and create a sentiment of really envisioning that better future. And I think as religious leaders and as religious institutions, we have the frameworks built within us to paint that portrait for all. So now we'll jump to the second question, which I think is very fitting, that in the first question being asked to religious leaders about what are the challenges, that we can't just stick to challenges, but we also speak to the things that we ended up doing and the opportunity. I think there's always that pairing of the optimism within us. But let's hone in, let's deep dive and look at what key interventions have really come up as opportunities that this moment has given us. I'll pass it back to Hugh first to begin us off. We've been talking a lot at the UN about how we need to build back better, not to build back to normal, right? Because normal was not serving us. That was a system that was broken in a way that those who were vulnerable and marginalized would go unheard. They were invisible and their plight was not addressed. And so in this moment of COVID, despite the challenges that we've heard earlier, it's also created an opportunity for us to really take transformative action. So from UNDRR's perspective and building on everything that you've heard so far, what key interventions have you seen that have created not only mutual beneficial impacts to address COVID, but also build resilience into the communities that we're responding so that we can ensure, like Fletcher was saying earlier, we don't just take care of the short term, but we can also heal and create the framework for a better long term?
Thank you, Steve. And yes, it's been a really interesting first round of discussions, and really want to pick up on what I think both Deborah and Father Fletcher mentioned about this change of course. And I think Deborah mentioned about we need to learn lessons, I think, from this pandemic. And often in a time of safety and stability, we don't think about the future. We don't think about that disasters could come. And I think this is really the time where we need to start thinking about risk reduction and to be aware of the risk that we are creating in a time of stability and you know, in the good times, and to be aware that the risk we're creating and intentionally will manifest itself in future. So to really take advantage of that, a really important point, and that shift in the change of mindset, I think. And I think faith-based organizations and all community organizations have a big role to play in that shift to prevention and risk reduction and away from response. Because I think this COVID-19, the disaster we're facing, really must be a watershed moment for a focus on risk reduction in all sectors, not just in the health sector. It was mentioned about the work that UNEP's doing in looking at agriculture, looking at ecosystems. It's not just a health issue. Risk reduction must be embedded in everything that we do. And I think this is the time that we need to make that mindset change. I think three important areas. One is in terms of understanding our risk. The other is in terms of risk governance. And the other is in terms of financing for risk reduction. And this is really at the core of the UN framework for the immediate social economic response to the COVID pandemic. There's a pillar on social cohesion and community resilience, which really looks at understanding risk at the community level to build resilience, also communicating that risk at the community level so people can make those changes during the times of safety and stability, as Deborah mentioned. I think the first pathway that was really important to take is to strengthen the understanding of risk. And this is one of the core objectives of UNDRR's COVID-19 action plan. Is also priority one, the first priority of the Sendai framework, is that we must understand our risk in order to reduce it and to develop policies and design policies and investments that will reduce rather than create risk. So reduce our current risk, but make sure they avoid creating new risks. And for want of a better word, the COVID pandemic has been an opportunity to really raise awareness of that, of the systemic nature of risk, that it goes across all sectors, and to take a multi-hazard approach. I think for far too long, we've looked at individual disasters in their silos, be it a hurricane, be it an earthquake, be it a pandemic. we don't look at the interconnections between these risks and the need to take a multi-hazard approach. And often our tools and our policies are not designed to help that. The tools, risk assessment tools will either look at a hurricane or look at an earthquake. They won't look at multi-hazard risk and at the impacts of disasters across different systems. So we need to invest, I think, in multi-dimensional risk assessment tools and to design policies based on that. And at UNDRR, in the past few months, we've been engaged in developing quite a few policy briefs on these issues. We developed a toolkit on resilient recovery for small and medium enterprises, policy briefs for government on how to respond to the climate emergency during the pandemic, quite a few tools like that. But what's been, I think, most important is working with governments is to integrate pandemic risk into their national disaster risk reduction strategies. And that's been an opportunity that we've taken these past 2 months. And also within the UN system, people might not be familiar with it, with what's called the Common Country Assessment. It's when all the UN agencies in the country come together now annually to look at the development landscape and the challenges, and also to look at the risks and to make sure that pandemic risk and disaster risk is taken into account there. The second issue I mentioned is risk governance. And a key part of that is this target E of the Sendai framework to have national strategies, DRR strategies in place by the end of the year. And that they must be inclusive and participatory. I think we're seeing that the impact of COVID, that the community action and developing strategies that are based on community needs. It's something we've been saying, many years, but now we're really seeing the importance of it, so that these strategies are developed in full, open, and inclusive consultation, and that they take a multi-hazard approach to risk governance. Disaster risk reduction is not just the realm of disaster management authorities. Every sector needs to take the national strategy and unpack it in their own sector, from health, education, from infrastructure. Disaster risk reduction really cuts across all. So this all of government approach to disaster risk, because one agency cannot reduce risk. It's something that needs to be shared by all. And also strengthening the science and policy interface. I think that's a pathway that really needs to be strengthened to understand risk. I think academia and scientists are doing a lot of work in this multi-hazard approach to risk assessment, and to create that link between policymakers, I think, and scientists and academia, I think needs to be strengthened in a big way. If we're going to develop strategies and policies that look at risk across different sectors, across different times, across different geographies, it's not easy, and most policymakers are not the experts in that. To strengthen that interface, I think it is really critical. It also helps governments then with trade-offs, especially in least developed countries. The idea that everything can be addressed simultaneously with such limited resources and capacity needs to be developed. So the idea that by applying a risk lens in your trade-offs, you can pick the activity or the SDG implementation of SDGs in a way that will have the most mutual benefit across different sectors, but will also create less risk across different sectors. So I think having that trade-off in our mind is really important. And the third, I would say, is financing. Is the way that the international financing system is set up is not fit for purpose for the world that we live in. I think I'm not the only one making that point, but we need to finance risk reduction. We cannot respond to another disaster in this way again. The economic, the social impact, the human impact, the loss of life has been so tremendous that we don't have the resources, and I think the energy to respond to a disaster of this magnitude again. So we have to start financing risk reduction. We have to start financing prevention and embedding it in all that we do. And that's a big barrier, I think, is that the financing is geared towards disaster response. We often look at, which obviously is very much needed and still needs to be there. We often look at insurance and things that will pay out after a disaster, which of course is very much needed. But the funding to invest in adaptation, climate adaptation, in disaster risk reduction, way ahead of a disaster, is not there yet. So to change the way domestic resource mobilization but also international finance is geared, is to focus on prevention, and that's both public and the private sector. And then lastly, I'd say it's going back to this building back better mantra that we've touched on a lot already this afternoon. But the idea that building back better is not just physical. I think for a long time, we've looked at infrastructure, how to rebuild roads and schools, which is super important in a more resilient way for the next disaster. But we really have to use this opportunity to build back better in a way that addresses the underlying root causes of vulnerability, of exclusion, of discrimination, and to really retool our societies towards more equitable societies. And I think, I think I'll leave it there. So really the 4 points will be to better understand our risk and to design policies according to that way, to strengthen risk governance, to strengthen financing prevention, and to really build back better to address some of the underlying social causes of risk. Thanks.
Thanks, Hugh, for that really comprehensive look. I think I've been taking so many notes, but like this whole session is just, whoo. But I think really from your side, this notion that I keep hearing is this thought of us wanting to rethink how we move forward, right? Because you're right, we cannot respond to a similar scale disaster in the future like this again. The loss of life, the sheer amount of tragedy that has been created from COVID alone has already shown us that our systems are inadequately prepared for this. But at the same time, you're also pointing to this great opportunity that we have because everyone's so focused on COVID, right? Like, what can we do? What can we do? We can build in these critical underlying root cause solutions that will help us ensure that moving forward, we won't have to face this magnitude of tragedy again. And so coming to our faith leaders now, thinking about this transformative perception that needs to take place. As faith leaders, we are one of the largest stakeholders in the hearts and minds of people. Over 84% of the world's population identifies as religious or spiritually affiliated. And so we have a strong opportunity in this moment to really create change in how we as a collective world perceive risk and preparedness. So I'd love to now pass it over to Deborah to give us some reflections from Tsuji's side of what do these opportunities, what kind of opportunities have COVID really brought to us and how do we act upon it?
Thank you, Hugh. Your comment for financial risk reduction is so critical and important. Faith-based organization currently really in a very unusual situation we call sandwich. We learn from the pandemic risk and we try to create the new normal. So I believe faith-based leadership, we never think about lockdown become our normal practice, where the face mask is a mandatory for a gathering, and to rethink about social distance inside our church. This is really create a totally new practice because of the pandemic. And the wisdom of the day, how Buddhism practiced the mitigation through the COVID-19. On the July 4th, our USA birthday, we talk about with social distancing and quarantine measures due to the pandemic, who can offer help for those who are suffering. It takes people with the heart of Bodhisattva who vows to walk the Bodhisattva path. So this time, we really think about lockdown leading to food shortage. And they don't, Father Aris can share about how they reach out the remote area and how we collaborate together. And this time, the social distance is not just a name called social distance. Inside the emergency operations center, the staff started to aware the social distance importance. Now we wear the mask. When you wear a mask, you are saying, I respect my neighbors. When you wear a mask, you are saying, I respect nurses and doctors. When you wear a mask, you are saying, I respect other people. Pandemic really remind us how we should respect each other and leave no one behind. Next slide, please. I remember Pope Francis, according to pandemic COVID-19 happened on March 28. He mentioned about the pandemic is not a judgment from God, but a time for us to judge, to choose what matters and what passes away. It is a time to get our lives back on track. And Master Zheng Yan, at the same time, on April 25th, she mentioned about pandemic, when it's going to be ended, no one knows. But what would be the most important prescription that everyone we can control by ourselves is your sincere heart and be changed from your daily practice. So the spiritual leaders, I only share Buddhist and Catholic during the time limitation. There's another faith-based leaders also stand up and to guide their followers to say how important at this time everybody have to work together. And they also face a huge, huge challenge at this moment as well because of the socio-economic crisis. One way they need to deliver the basic need, the mass care, the food. The other way they have to figure out where is their financial support. So Hugh, you mentioned about the faith-based, how to face the financial risk reduction. This is a huge learning. From faith-based organization, next slide, please. We really need to think about at this moment, how we can work together, everyone, we can follow governance. We all can follow that. But life goes on every day, move forward. How, as a faith-based leaders, how can we be more resilient in self-support? Every day when you wake up, you need to have food, you need to have transportation, you have housing issue, you have basic materials needs. So now what we try to empower every single walks of life, the people around the community. Like July 3rd, we share, if we truly wish to protect and love living beings together, we should not contribute to killing them. So we try to coexist with each others. And then July 5th, the more people who adopt a meatless diet, the more blessings are created. By offering 500 vegetarian lunchbox to the public, the life of 38 chickens and 1 pig are saved. The message we try to share with all the community, how we going to balance daily. When we have a food on a table with our palms together in gratitude, we cherish our peace and safety, facing the heavens in repentance. We sincerely vow to awaken, yet sincerely is not something be expressed only with words. More important, we must express through our action. So through the message, we also leading to the community to think about, when we talk about financial planning, then how can we become, we don't have money, but how can we be available for daily resilience? If we consider overeating is harmful, then eating simply healthy. If we eat only 80% full, we can save the remaining 20% to help those who are suffering from hunger. So you can see 4 different statements, 4 different cartoons. The education message try to deliver it right here. Pandemic bring the interfaith working together. The partnership really demonstrate the opportunity for every one of us. Leave no one behind. empower ourselves, be a resilient, prepare. So disaster risk reduction started from ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. I think really building on Hugh's comments about this notion of trying to create mutual benefits, right? Through addressing one issue of zoonotic diseases, we can create momentum around our own individual consumption habits, which then extends back to climate action. As we look at this problem that we're facing with COVID-19 of how thinly spread our resources are, we must begin to reconceptualize usage of resources, right? We must begin to think about what it means to be full, 100% full versus 80% full. And notions like this, I think that sort of innovation are very prevalent within the faith community. So I'm really excited now to hear from Father Aris about what the Camillus community has been doing as opportunities that have been created from COVID-19 in responding to it to create resilience and mitigate risk.
Okay. Yeah, my reflections on this is practically based on what we have done so far, and from our previous experiences, not only during COVID, but with Ebola and other kinds of crisis related to health. Okay. The first thing that I would like to share here is we try, as I mentioned a while ago, that we try to maximize emergency relief response. No? We do relief goods and food and non-food distribution. And I think you have seen that picture a while ago in the slides of Deborah in India, wherein we partner with them. And doing that, we are not only simply distributing relief goods, but it's also a way for us to identify needs, gaps, and resources, especially in the less developed countries. No? We're not doing only in India, but we're also doing in different places in Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean. We created space and moment wherein the voice of the vulnerable people can be heard, expressing the real situation and needs. In this way, we can understand who among them are the most vulnerable, what resources, human and material, do they have, and who else is with them in this moment of crisis. I think this approach is very fundamental in all our undertakings of building resilience in different communities. Secondly, we include vulnerable people's right from the very start in the problem identification and analysis, analyzing those who are most affected and continue to be impacted not only by COVID, but most especially by climate change that poses the greatest existential threat, and seek solutions together, which is what builds resilience. It builds community cooperation and cohesion. It builds social capital necessary to bring in people together as a community. It is here where faith-based organizations are good at, because faith builds community, trust, and confidence. It builds inclusion. And inclusion reduces inequality and voicelessness. So participation and inclusion are the key pathways of action. The third is collaboration and partnership building. We have heard a while ago that experience of transcending our differences. We treat vulnerable communities as partners and not just beneficiaries. Faith-based leaders can easily facilitate this process of partnership building because of their presence in these communities, even before COVID-19. Another one is network building that becomes the basis for a sustainable response as well as a political action to address the impact of COVID and climate change to the vulnerable communities. CADES engages with partners and collaborators from diverse faith-based groups. We, the faith-based organizations, are in a unique position to work with partners on social mobilization, community engagement, delivery of services, and influencing behavioral changes among the affected populace because of our meaningful presence. And this is what CADES International is doing, to emerge from its traditional approach of developing actions in isolation from the actors towards engagement with partners and collaborators, building on the strength of networks or the diverse faith-based groups. Another important thing also is provide spiritual and psycho-emotional social support to vulnerable communities. In this period of pandemic, fear, stigma, and misunderstanding are the pertinent issues which is not given much attention and response. Psychosocial care includes measures designed to treat mental, spiritual, and emotional trauma and the effects of stigmatization and marginalization that occur following infection. It refers to support administered both in informal or pastoral settings, such as in our churches, or in professional settings, such as in our hospitals and clinics. And second to the last is build resilience to the local health systems. And this is what I have experienced also in 2014 in Sierra Leone during the Ebola crisis. Faith-based actors add distinct value to health systems and infrastructure in two key ways. First, the constructions of local systems and networks. And second, the mobilization of these networks, which include not only health providers, but the church itself, its parishes and orders. The constructions of local network makes healthcare services available within communities, and network mobilization activates the power of the relationship forged through that presence. Embedded in these two critical activities is the unique commitment of faith-based actors to a holistic, integral approach to healthcare, which places as much an emphasis on attending to physical needs as it does to alleviating emotional and spiritual suffering. And lastly, we employ a holistic approach, treating the person and not just the issue or the problem in our programs, and make health as defined by WHO, which is not merely an absence of disease, but total well-being as our goal and mission. While the spiritual need of the person is vaguely presented and less evident, it underlines in almost all human issues. Thus, our presence and accompaniment in the process of finding solutions and achieving our goals is necessary.
Thank you, Father Aris, for those fantastic reflections. I think really looking at the work that Caddis International has been doing speaks to the spirit of community-led development, not just coming in to address the issue that the person faces, but working hand in hand with the community and deeply listening to them to identify what those needs are is something that as faith leaders we excel in, and it's something that we would offer to the international community to aspire to do, to not just address this microtonal problem that we face, but the larger root systemic issue that is being underlying this whole manifestation of a problem. So now I'm really happy to pass it over to Audrey to give us reflections from PWR's side, really thinking about how do we emerge from our so-called traditional approaches, ways of thinking that may not necessarily benefit the individual holistically, and maintain the beauty of the good in our traditions, but emerge towards new ways of being and thinking and doing in this COVID moment that has been created for us. Audrey, you're on mute. Give me 1 second.
Thank you so much, Steve. I think you bring up a very important issue here, and that is talking to faith communities which have been increasingly recognized, because you started this conversation with saying that over 80% of the world's populations are, believers in some faith tradition. So also, there is increasing recognition of the importance of engaging with faith-based communities. A lot of the conversation has been, especially from Hugh and the other panelists, have been this aspect of creating, strategic plan to be proactive rather than reactive. And it's not as if we have not had disasters, natural or otherwise, facing us before. But this pandemic has really compelled us to really change our thinking from reactivity to more proactivity. And this is one of the biggest challenges that has been brought to the forefront of our awareness by this pandemic, and has been that of a coordinated strategy. And of course, we've been talking about the importance of all the different networks and the stakeholders and partners to engage in, and to have a coordinated strategy in multilateral processes, because that's what we're talking about, to address how each, in the US, for example, how each of the 50 states can find coherence without having had the benefit of, like, for example, federal leadership. And so we need our government leaders to step into the role of leadership and devise and create a coherent strategy, for example, for the entire country. And toward that end, I want to share what the UN has done as an opportunity that has arisen because of this COVID-19 to create a comprehensive response to the engagement of faith-based actors in its global pledge for action by religious actors and faith-based organizations to address COVID-19 pandemic in collaboration with the UN. So here we have an immediate engagement, and this is a new opportunity to work with the UN from a global, comprehensive perspective. So on April 20th, 2020, the Secretary General, in his message to celebrate Easter, Passover, and the beginning of Ramadan in recognition that we live in a multi-faith world, issued a call for religious leaders to unite in the fight against COVID-19. So simultaneously, religious leaders and members of faith-based organizations have also urged for greater solidarity and collaboration, including with the UN. So the UN is important as a leading, guiding global institution. So their engagement with faith-based organization and religious leaders is very important. So this pledge is designed to be action and result oriented. So it contains concrete initiatives and actions in response to the calls by the UN Secretary General and numerous religious leaders and faith-based organizations. So the pledge for action is guided by international human rights standards and the Agenda for Sustainable Development. It calls for, among other things, for a global ceasefire and the COVID-19 Global Humanitarian Response Plan and the guidance of the World Health Organization and human rights mechanisms on COVID-19. So we see the different agencies coming together now under a strategic plan. And it also suggests that actions contribute to fostering capacity building and peer learning activities at the community level as well. So all the different processes are being incorporated. And importantly, in the joint call for solidarity, compassion, and unity by the High Representative of the UN Alliance of Civilizations and Adema Deng, who's a special advisor for the prevention of genocide, address the need for social solidarity and building bridges of kindness and compassion that transcend man-made walls. So this is the important language of building bridges. And they also called for the protection of the most vulnerable, including the elderly, who are bearing the brunt of this pandemic. And they stressed the imperative to stand up, as Fletcher was talking about earlier, against stigma, hate speech, xenophobia, racism, and all forms of discrimination that are an affront to universal human values and rights. So there is recognition that beating the pandemic will involve effective international cooperation and implementing an all-society approach, one that includes national governments, civil society, media, private companies, faith actors, youth, and women. In short, all sectors of society. So the Alliance of Civilizations seeks to foster intercultural and interfaith dialogue, building bridges of understanding, and countering stereotyping and polarization. Undersecretary General Adema Deng emphasized that his office is stepping up its efforts to implement the UN strategy and plan of action on hate speech globally and nationally to counter hate speech and the related stigmatization and discrimination. So both Mr. Deng and the High Representative of the Alliance of Civilizations indicated that if we want societies to be inclusive, cohesive, and peaceful, this is the time to foster an alliance between cultures, civilizations, and people. And there is no time to lose. Therefore, the opportunities lie in working with our leading guiding institutions and other faith communities to bring together a coherent strategy and an action plan for implementation by which measurable results can be ascertained. And this action plan by religious actors and faith-based organizations to address this pandemic in collaboration with the United Nations has been set forth, and it is a very comprehensive plan. And here it is. I printed it up, and I mean, it's almost like a whole ream of paper. I've done the index and, put it all together. And believe me, it is quite comprehensive, and it addresses 14 platforms. So it has a space for every partner that we can imagine, but it is exactly what Hugh and others have been talking about in creating a comprehensive strategy. So that is the exciting opportunity that has been created as a result of this pandemic. And I wanted to also share that with this community today. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Audrey, for sharing that. And oh my goodness, it's such a huge booklet. And so we'll definitely also link it in our conversation after the fact as well to share with those who are watching afterwards. I think really looking at this moment, it's not just about us taking action as faith-based organizations independently, but us coming together to create that watershed moment. There was a question asked in the chat earlier of how do we ensure that this moment doesn't just fade into our collective memory and end up being just another challenge that we faced as humanity, but we really catalyze this as a moment to transform. And I'm really grateful, Audrey, that you laid out a roadmap for us forward with working and collaborating with each other and the UN. I'll now pass it over to Fletcher to give us some perspectives from Green Faith's space of how COVID-19 has really created catalytic opportunities to do the work needed to forward Agenda 2030.
Thanks, Steve. At the beginning of the pandemic, we did an internal discussion within our team and asked, what is it that we can do? What is it that we're well positioned to do given our past work, the community that we serve? And what we decided was that we could offer a consistent time and format for honest, open reflection and spiritual respite and mutual support as a beginning step towards the development of local circles of care and resilience. We were struck and have been struck over the years. The Federal Emergency Management Administration in the United States did some research about what it was that ensured or played a major contributing role to people's survival of different natural disasters and major disruptions. And very interestingly, what the study showed was that there were a number of important contributing factors. The most important factor was whether people knew their neighbors or not, because that level of human connection is so important when things start to go south, to use an expression. So we started in March, very soon after the pandemic began, and offered at first daily, and then we transitioned to weekly multi-faith calls for care and resilience. We structured them intentionally in a consistent ritualized format. Every day at the beginning of the call, we lit a candle online and encouraged people to bring their own candles to be lit online. Every day we had a consistent script that we followed so as to give a sense of repetition and regularity and consistency, like the rituals that all of our different religious and spiritual traditions offer in our places of meditation and prayer and reflection. Each day we had, or each call, we had a representative of a different religious or spiritual tradition, including our good friends at the Buddhist Tzu Chi Foundation, to offer a 6 to 8 minute reflection from the perspective of their tradition. And we asked very particularly for each speaker to make sure that they made reference to their own sacred writings or sacred texts, because we know that in these times when we feel under great stress, that those writings and texts represent a source of support and of encouragement from beyond our normal rational minds, and that that's something that each of us needs. These calls, then, we always worked in breakout groups online so that people would have a chance to reflect at a much more personal level what they were wrestling with, what they were experiencing. And we found that the response to these calls was extraordinarily positive. People really do need, in the midst of all of this, a human, open, vulnerable, honest place to connect. This is not an optional part of a response to these disruptions and these disasters. It's absolutely obligatory. And what it does is it models and it enables the beginning of the creation of these local personal relationships, which Father Aris referred to, which become the basis of solidarity. They become the basis of local organizing. They become the basis of building networks and communities of care and resilience, and ultimately the kind of moral and relational power that we need in order to have society transformed. So, it was a very simple thing to do. To produce it well took some effort, but it reaffirmed for us the absolutely vital importance of a deep human connection as a fundamental part of our response to this or any other crisis, and the building blocks on which all further efforts can be based. So I'll stop there. It was and we continue to do those calls on a weekly basis now, because the response has been really wonderful.
Thank you so much, Fletcher, for those reflections and really for bringing the human element to our response. I think it's what compels us and motivates us at the core to relate to each other and empathize and have that compassion, and to have a space that really develops that is so critical in this continued moment of COVID-19. We have one set of final questions really asking our panelists to reflect with us how faith-based organizations have added value to the work of the COVID response. But I think just in these two questions alone, we've really heard such a wealth of that I feel remiss to have to ask that again. Maybe instead, as we come to the close of our session, we can just go to each one of our speakers in the same order once more for some final reflections, some final thoughts. Is there anything you want our audience to take away from this conversation and move forward with? I'll pass it over to Hugh first.
Thank you, Steve, and to all the other presenters for a really interesting discussion. Really enjoyed it. As my final remark, I'd like to reflect on what Sendai framework calls a culture of prevention. And I think faith-based organizations and all community organizations, but specifically faith-based organizations, hard to say sometimes, have a really important role to play in this culture of prevention and risk reduction. I think this, there has been, a long history and an incredible track record of faith-based organizations providing, compassion and relief in the event of a disaster. But I think that energy can also be applied to this culture of risk reduction and prevention that we need to instill in society, in all of society. And as Audrey said about the shift from being reactive to being preventive, and as Deborah said, that, which I love, that DRR starts within oneself, and it's absolutely true. And I think faith-based organizations have a really big role to play in that shift to a culture of prevention. It's also really important to make sure that we have the right organizations serving the needs of those communities each time. And two other things I think is really important to reflect on, I think has been touched on, is mental health and the important role of faith-based organizations in providing mental health care after a disaster. I think it's often overlooked. I'm sure faith-based organizations could do with a lot more resources and attention to provide that service. I think we need to focus on that one. And lastly, not so much COVID related, but an important aspect of Sendai framework and of disaster risk reduction that is overlooked is cultural heritage, especially after climate-related disasters, and seismic disasters, is the destruction of cultural heritage. And I think faith-based and religious organizations have a really crucial role to play, because so much of our cultural heritage is rooted in religion and has an important role to play and needs support to protect cultural heritage and religious institutions in the event of a disaster. But I'll leave it there, and thank you so much again for inviting me. It's been a great discussion.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Hugh. I'll now pass it over to Deborah.
Okay, thank you so much. I really learned a lot today. The final way I would like to share and invite everybody to think about it. On the screen, you can see these 7 C: compassion, communication, cooperation, coordination, collaboration, commitment, continuing education. No matter we are talking about faith-based organization, civil society organization, or multi-language, multicultural, everything all integrate together. And you see the lanyard, the colorful one, and the one on the top of Lotus Sutra. The difference in between these two is the Lotus Sutra have a big circle, and we're talking about SDG 17. Each SDG has its own lanyard. If we can put everybody's efforts together, we can bring the SDG 17 to 2030 as a big circle for peace and harmony, and how as a team we can make this happen. So SDG is not a logo or slogan, and we need civil society, FBO, NGO, INGO, PPP, and United Nations, so many PWR, everybody working together. We can do ourselves outcome indicator. If your lanyard can be a team and can stand up and make sure it's functional, then we have a successful outcome partnership. And if we don't, how we can improve that? So all the fundamental concept, you need to have a spiritual practice in guidance when the challenges come. Especially now, we are established the new normal based on what kind of fundamental principle that we are looking for. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. We'll now pass it over to Father Aris.
Okay, if we want really to achieve those SDGs by 2030, or at least near to that, I think that can be possible if we journeyed and bring in people, particularly those people whom we are serving. Because I do believe that they are not mere beneficiaries of the services that we have been doing, but they are really real partners and actors in order that these goals will be achieved. And I think let's build from that strength, because that's who we are, faith-based organizations. We have a mission to journey and accompany the marginalized communities, and we can build that together. And I think it is in that way that we will be able to achieve those goals. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Aris. I'll now pass it to Audrey.
Thank you so much. In my closing thoughts, I'd like to share the statement of solidarity from the New Alliance of Virtues, which states in relevant part, the way to serve and save humanity lies in doing that which is good, in love and charity, and in mutual solidarity. In these critical times, we must deepen our recognition that we as humans are part of one family, sharing one home, planet Earth. Our religions in this current crisis are clearly teaching us the truth of caring for the most vulnerable in our communities, such as the poor, the hungry, and the homeless. Our religions oblige us to seek the safety, well-being, and protection of every soul from all forms of harm, whether they be epidemics, pandemics, oppression, or wars. So our faith communities provide the moral, spiritual, and ethical dimensions of all that needs to be addressed of the many global challenges. And it is important for faith communities to develop in each adherent the moral, spiritual, and ethical dimensions of selfless service to help to make this world a better, more harmonious and peaceful place. And I finally want to express my deepest appreciation to the Tzu Chi Foundation, our panelists, and all of our viewers for taking the time to have this rich conversation today. And may I be privileged to cross paths with each of you many times over in my lifetime, for being with those who understand the importance of selfless service for the betterment of humanity is always time well spent. So thank you.
Thank you, Audrey. I'll pass it over to Fletcher.
Thanks. I'm find myself almost every time round on Father Aris's team in terms of identifying. I mean, I think, you know, if we really want to get the kind of cultural transformation that's needed to change the politics and the economics around these things in the long term, we have to undertake a massive local leadership development and movement building perspective, because that will be the way that first of all, we have the ability to make change at the scale that's needed. And it plays to our natural identity as religious and spiritual communities to lift up local leadership, to equip people with skills, to prioritize local voices. And so I think that this pandemic sort of calls on us, I think, to invest more in that kind of distributed, decentralized leadership development, because it's a critically important part of the future. It can be coordinated behind the kind of beautiful high-level vision that Audrey just articulated. And it must be strongly rooted locally, because that is how we will get to the better future that all of us want.
Thank you, Fletcher. With this, I'd like to thank all of our panelists for being with us, for sharing their expertise at this particularly poignant moment at the high-level political forum, where we're all grappling with how to move forward. If there's one thing that we've really taken away from this rich and fantastic conversation, is the boundless wealth of knowledge and actions that are taking place from our various faith communities and partners who work with faith communities serve as a way forward. It is the foundation